Welcome to the PraXis podcast. PraXis is a conversation about the intersection of science-based wellness and Christian spiritual practice. We cover 3 topic areas: mindfulness, fitness, and diet. For more information, you can just Google us at PraXis Christian Wellness.
Today, we're very lucky to have Irene Kraegel, who's a clinical psychologist and author of the book, The Mindful Christian, Cultivating a Life of Intentionality, Openness, and Faith. She also does a number of trainings and speaking engagements, and she's here to talk to us about what is Christian mindfulness. Hi, Irene. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
It's a real pleasure because you're sort of one of the few people who does sort of exactly what we talk about here, are 3 things: Christian mindfulness, or the mindfulness as it relates to Christian prayer and the evidence-based practice of mindfulness. We also talk about fitness and diet. And so you are the person to ask this question: what is Christian mindfulness?
Well, mindfulness, as you probably know, is the practice of paying attention to the present moment with a particular attitude of non-judgment, acceptance, curiosity. So when I think about Christian mindfulness, I think about doing that with an awareness of God's presence. We know that God has created all things. So when we practice mindfulness, we're bringing our attention into the present moment to pay attention to what's right here, and we have the opportunity to acknowledge our Creator as we do that, to notice that everything that's here in the moment is actually given by God, and also that we're in God's presence. And we sometimes think about that a lot as Christians and forget to connect with God's presence in the moment. So Christian mindfulness gives us a chance to notice that God is with us in any given moment and to be present with that awareness of God being there with us.
Wow. And how did you come to this sort of practice within the psychological field?
Well, I came to it because I'm a psychologist, first of all. And so anybody in the mental health field has been hearing a lot about mindfulness over the last maybe 15 years or so. And working with college students, as I do right now, there's lots of stress going around. Of course, being a human being is stressful, but that is particularly the case during the college years. And so in my work with college students, I was very eager to find all the tools that I could share with students who are looking to manage their stress well. And also students coming to grips with some pretty big mental health challenges, sometimes for the first time as they entered the college environment. So that was all a professional motivation to understand mindfulness, to make sure that I had the latest and greatest tools in my professional work. But also I was very personally driven for this as well. Having experienced depression throughout my own life, I've used plenty of tools. And as I learned about mindfulness, I felt like this was possibly a tool that could help me go deeper in my own healing journey. As a Christian and a person of faith, I'm always eager for psychological tools that have some depth to them, that don't just have a cognitive component, although the cognitive aspects of psychological treatment are crucial, but also realizing that for myself, just focusing on thoughts and cognitions had always felt a bit surfacey and only went so far for me personally. And I was attracted to the aspect of mindfulness that allows us to go a bit deeper into our experience. So for me, it felt like a natural connection with my own faith journey. And that personal motivation is part of what drove me to explore it as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Myself, I came to it through meditation and a desire to help me focus. But also, as I grew older and grew into realization that I had my own anxiety and depression challenges, then I looked to this practice of meditation for help. And this is, how is it different than than meditation. It's jargon. We try to talk about the difference between contemplation in the Christian sense and meditation in the sort of popular New Age or popular parlance. And then there's mindfulness. Is there a distinction for you between those three terms?
There is. There's a lot of overlap, but they are also different, and that can be quite confusing. So I can share my take on it. I think of contemplation as maybe the broadest of all of those terms. Contemplation covers a lot of different practices that have to do with silence and presence. And certainly in the Christian tradition, we have many, many examples of contemplative practices over the years, some of which are inclusive of meditation. But there are other types of contemplation that may be a bit more general, anything having to do with silence, awareness, presence. I think of that as, maybe in the simplest way, maybe the quieter forms of Christian worship would be contemplative. So even something, for example, like a Taizé worship service, which includes a lot of repetitive singing and has meditative aspects to the worship service. But there are portions of that service that would be contemplative without necessarily being meditation directly. And then we have the term meditation, which typically means any time that we are being quite focused on something. And so here we think in Christian tradition about the ways that we use the word meditation to refer maybe to focusing in a repeated way on scripture. So we may talk about biblical meditation. But there are also movement meditations. So meditation doesn't necessarily mean sitting still. We have our conceptions of meditation as, kind of sitting still in a cross-legged position with our hands in a certain way. And there is that type of meditation, but generally meditation is just any time that we are kind of in silence, focusing our attention on one particular thing. And that is also a very broad term. So there are many kinds of meditation that are not necessarily mindfulness meditation, but lots of different types of meditation that can be helpful. And then mindfulness includes meditation. There's lots of overlap there, but not all mindfulness is formal meditation. I feel like I need a whiteboard here as I kind of explore all of it. But, mindfulness is, if we come back to that definition of paying attention to the present moment without judgment, that certainly can be done in meditation, and it often is. So there are formal mindfulness meditation practices that include things like a body scan, sitting practices. There are walking meditations and other types of movement practices, a loving kindness practice, mountain meditation, etc. There's sort of a standard set of formal mindfulness practices. And many of those have been really popularized over the past few decades through the mindfulness-based stress reduction course out of the University of Massachusetts. And so many of the mindfulness meditations that we're the most familiar with in, in modern Western culture are out of that particular tradition, MBSR as we call it. But mindfulness can also be practiced informally. So anytime during the day, 24/7, we have the opportunity to pause and notice what's happening in the present moment, to notice what's here for us right now. So that may not look like stopping what we're doing and entering into formal meditation. That could simply be as we walk down the hall, or as we're getting out of bed in the morning, or as we take a bite of food, or as we're in the midst of a difficult conversation, whatever's going on in the moment, informally noticing what's present for us. That would also be mindfulness, even though it doesn't necessarily include meditation.
Now, you mentioned an acronym there, which was, I think, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And that's sort of one of the evidenced results of these practices, is it does reduce stress. And why?
Yeah, so much of our stress is kind of feeds on itself. We tend to get pretty stressed about our stress. And that is one of the ways that our mind creates its own suffering, as we sometimes say in the mindfulness field. And so one of the things that mindfulness allows us to do is to notice that looping. So to notice our reactions, our thoughts, and our behaviors in reaction to some of our very normal human experiences and normal human emotions. So stress is a great example of that. If we can learn to be curious about our stress, to notice when our stress comes up, what are we thinking about that experience? How are we labeling it? What are we predicting about the future based on our current feeling of stress? What are we remembering about the past as we experience that stress in the moment? And that type of movement of our mind into the past and the future can increase our stress in the moment if we're not conscious and intentional about how we're working with that. So through mindfulness practices, we learn to get curious about our stress reactions, to notice the fight, flight, freeze response as that kicks in our bodies. From a Christian framework, I think of that as noticing our bodies reacting to the present moment in some pretty nifty ways that God has made. So we actually have this amazing alarm system in our body that helps to keep us safe. And we experience that as stress or sometimes as anxiety. And when we can see that with some curiosity and openness to how God made us, then we're less likely to start to judge that experience, to think there's something wrong with us, to judge that experience. And we're more likely to allow it to come and go, more like an experience of a wave. You know, a wave comes and then it goes. We don't expect a wave to stay in the same place all the time because water is constantly moving. And that's very much how our stress is. Now, this is focused on stress, but really, we often use the word stress to describe a really wide range of human experiences and a wide range of emotional discomfort. So we could substitute here depression or anger or jealousy or any emotion that feels somewhat uncomfortable. And the more we expect ourselves as humans not to have uncomfortable emotions, the harsher we can be with ourselves when we are uncomfortable, and the more we can exacerbate that suffering that we're experiencing. So mindfulness allows us to create a little bit of observational distance with those kinds of uncomfortable emotions, including stress. Not distance in the sense of getting cut off from the emotion, but more that we're taking a step back and turning our attention toward that emotion, toward that experience, so that we can be curious and open and accepting of, okay, this is my experience right now. This is the emotion that I'm having. Let me notice what thoughts come with that, what feelings come with that, what physical sensations come with that. What are some of the behaviors that I'm engaging in, or urges, behaviors I would like to engage in response to that. And then as Christians, we also have the opportunity to notice as we create that observational distance. Let me also notice that God is present here with me in this moment, in this emotion. And all of that then allows us to care for ourselves more effectively, so that rather than kind of kicking ourselves while we're down in that moment of discomfort, we're actually learning to show ourselves some compassion and care in that moment. And that actually allows the wave of discomfort to pass more quickly and more effectively, not on our own time. You know, we can't force emotional discomfort to change, but when we treat it with some care and compassion and openness, it's much more likely to pass all on its own.
Now, there's sort of two things in there, which is to kind of witness what is arising mentally and emotionally. And there's another thing you said there, which is an exploration of those things that arise. And so here, you know, we talk a little bit about centering prayer and contemplation. And it's something I usually say is that we go through mindfulness to get to contemplation in the practice of centering prayer, and that to sit in the presence of the Lord, you first have to sort of get out of the woods of your own thoughts. And so a phase of centering prayer is to sit with those thoughts and then just to turn away to a sacred word. And that's sort of, is that sort of the a mindfulness technique? And I do want to get to the exploration of thoughts and emotions next, but just first on the kind of the witnessing of these things, and not to be to learn to let them go and move on, and see that they will arise and pass. Is that part of centering prayer? Is that what you perceive, or is that just me just making stuff up?
I think that relationship between mindfulness and centering prayer is fascinating, and there are lots of different interpretations on that. People who are practicing mindfulness that don't necessarily have Christian faith might sometimes say that centering prayer can't be mindfulness because it's based in religion. And I disagree with that. I think that it really has to do with our worldview. And so as a Christian, I actually believe that God is always part of the present moment. This isn't sort of like a religious idea I'm imposing on my mindfulness practice. It's more that I truly believe God is here all the time. So in any given moment in mindfulness practice, I can choose to focus my attention on any aspect of that present moment experience. And so mindfulness practitioners will choose, as they start any given meditation or practice, they will choose which aspect of the present moment would they like to focus in on. So if I'm doing a sitting practice, I might choose to focus on the experience of breathing for a while, the physical sensations of breath coming in and out of the body. I might choose to focus for some time on thoughts passing through the mind, perhaps on feelings that are coming up. I might choose to focus on sounds in the environment, and noticing thoughts and emotions in reaction to those sounds. I can choose to focus on taste or sight or any sense that I might be having in the moment. So that's all very standard mindfulness practice. And then as a Christian, I argue that one of the objects of our attention can always be God's presence. Just like the sounds that are in the moment, the sights, the breath, the smells, God's presence is also available to us as an object of our attention in the present moment. So that's how I personally define centering prayer. Centering prayer for me is a practice of mindfulness, choosing to focus my attention on God's presence in the moment. Now, obviously, centering prayer also traditionally has this aspect of choosing a sacred word, or sometimes using the breath itself as that prompt for our attention to come back to God's presence in the present moment. And so that piece of it, I think using the breath as the anchor for our attention during centering prayer is probably the most consistent with mindfulness practice, because with mindfulness we are often using breath as one of the ways to bring our attention back to the present moment. So typically when I'm practicing centering prayer, I do generally use the breath as that prompt for my attention to come back to God's presence. But whatever that prompt is for us in centering prayer, I think we can conceptualize it rather than mindfulness and centering prayer being two separate practices that we're joining together. I think it's very possible to see it as centering prayer being a form of mindfulness where we're choosing God's presence as the object of our attention during that time. So in that sense, just like in any mindfulness practice, we don't have to get rid of thoughts. We don't have to clear them out. We don't have to change how we're feeling. And centering prayer traditionally is inviting us to notice those thoughts that come up and then to redirect our attention back to God's presence, which again is very consistent with mindfulness, where we often talk about noticing where our thoughts have gone off to, and then gently picking up our attention and bringing it back to where we would like it to be. And so in this case, that would be noticing our thoughts have wandered off, and then gently picking up our attention and bringing it back to God's presence using that prompt, whatever we decided it would be for the centering prayer practice. That's how I see it.
That's wonderful. Thank you for teasing that out in a more professional way. And I love the comment that centering prayer can't be mindfulness because it comes from religion. I think there's plenty who would argue that mindfulness is coming from the Vedic and downstream from Buddhism, for several thousand years before Western psychology got a hold of it. But anyway, I digress. The second sort of modality that you talked about was to examine the thoughts, or maybe just to inquire. I think, as you said, to more gently examine is probably too rigorous a word. But I bring it up because there are also Christian equivalents of that. When you squirrel down into the traditions, there's the examine, the Ignatian examine, and there are certainly in the Orthodox tradition, there's a discerning of spirits and what they would call the passions, which are kind of attachments. It's a very early psychological way of saying these emotions are objects, and we're going to look at what that emotional object is, and see what it's about. So I kind of have two questions there. Are you familiar with those practices is the first question there. And do they correspond to sort of what the evidence-based practice, the modality of sort of exploring your thoughts and emotions are? Do those two things match up?
Yeah, well, I appreciate you highlighting kind of the limits of the word examining, because that has a very cognitive tone to it. And with mindfulness, we're intentionally choosing not to analyze or interpret or overthink our observations. You just used the word exploring, which I think is a very delightful word when it comes to mindfulness practice. We have this opportunity to explore. We often use the word, which resonates for some people and not for others, but the word curiosity when we're talking about this mindful exploration of what's present for us. And the idea of the word curiosity is that we're bringing sort of a lightness to our observation. We are going through the different aspects of our experience in any given moment and just seeing what we can find, right? Kind of coming to each moment as if for the very first time. We're bringing this beginner's mind to each moment because each moment is, in fact, new. So every single moment that we're living is one that we have never lived before. And we always have this opportunity then to discover something new. Even if we think it's the same old, even if it looks familiar to us, we have literally never been in this moment before. We have never taken this breath before. We have never been in whatever space we're in this particular body with this particular set of thoughts and feelings and circumstances. And so mindfulness gives us this opportunity to explore what is here. Let me be curious about this, and let me be open to it and accepting of whatever is here. And I love how Christian faith can ground this practice if people choose to integrate the two. For me, my Christian faith gives me a confidence that I can explore every single moment as I'm in God's hands, that God is sovereign. God created what is here. And so I can let go of some of the control of trying to make this moment a certain way or thinking it has to be a certain way, because I know that God is sovereign and I'm in God's hands as I engage in that exploration. Now, examination, that other word, also has a really important role, both in psychology and also in Christian faith. And there are a lot of practices, mental health practices and faith practices that have us really go through a cognitive process about our experience. So I think about something like the prayer of examine, which has a mindful component to it, but ultimately it's a thought practice. It's going through our day or whatever time period we choose and thinking certain things, kind of guiding ourselves through the day in a particular cognitive way. And when we do that, it does allow for an emotional experience. It allows for mindfulness to get worked in. But mindfulness is a bit different than that, in that with mindfulness, we're not thinking about what's happening. And in fact, one of the most challenging and delightful aspects of mindfulness practice is learning to have experiences outside of the filter of thought and language. So, you know, if we notice right now, what does it feel like to be sitting on a chair, for example? I can pretty quickly put words on that. Is it soft? Is it hard? Where are points of pressure? Or what is that experience like? But mindfulness has us having the experience as directly as possible before we start to put language on it. And maybe notice the language we put on it, but practice being directly present to that experience outside of that filter of language and thought. So in that sense, we're not examining it in a way of, let me really understand this, or let me describe this, or let me label this, or think about it. It's more learning to simply have the experience. And again, when I think about the integration of Christian faith, it gets me excited to think of learning to receive these gifts that God is giving us in each moment, a bit more like a kid, like a little child, like Scripture asks us to do, where they're not necessarily analyzing every gift that they get. There's more, if you've ever seen a really small child receive a gift, there tends to just be more of a raw reaction, right? They grab for it, or they explore it, or they stick it in their mouth, or depending on how old they are. But there's more of a direct experiential reception of that gift. And that's what we get to do through mindfulness practice with God. It's a more direct receiving of these gifts that are present for us in each moment without necessarily having to examine them cognitively along the way.
That's great. And I think those are great answers. And I think there's a lot that contemplative practices could learn from this mindfulness, the gentle nature of the mindfulness practices. And it's almost like we're in a third space here, a little bit where my questions might lead to a place that's not quite traditional contemplative practice and not quite traditional mindfulness here. But I wanted to talk about the challenges that maybe mindfulness and Christianity present. So earlier talked about sitting in a state of non-judgment and pure awareness. So, and in the present moment. So there's a number of things that could be problematic with a Christian upbringing or Christian, very strong faith that is about judging good and bad. And it is thinking maybe very forward into salvation. And what are the kind of sort of doctrinal issues that come up that make it more challenging? Or are there? Maybe I'm just, second guessing it.
No, I think that's a great question. And it's kind of a fascinating area to me, partially because of my own personal background. I, have Christians in my family, and I was raised largely in the church. And a lot of my family doesn't have any Christian connection at all. And I often feel like I have my feet in a couple different worlds. And I would argue that being judgmental is not, that Christians don't really have a corner on being judgmental. And if we look at our political world right now, I kind of feel like anywhere we go in the world, really what we run into is that humans seem to inherently have a very deep desire to judge ourselves and one another, whether we attach that to religion or not. I often joke, having been raised in a family that was one part like kind of countercultural hippie. My parents met in a commune, and I was raised in that world. And then one part fundamentalist Christian. That was kind of the other half of my upbringing. And those were equally fundamentalist. Right? Like both of those worlds continue to have very strong opinions about how people are supposed to be.
Right. Irene, put that crystal around your neck right now.
Yeah, exactly. Right. A lot of judgments about society, about, culture, things like that. And so I think that being judgmental comes very naturally to humans. I think it's a way that we try to feel some control and safety. If we can kind of decide what's good and bad, then we feel like we have a little bit of control in the world. So yes, this is incredibly hard for people. It's hard for Christians. It's hard for people who don't have any religious connection. It's very hard to give up that judgmental lens. And fortunately, in mindfulness, we don't have to give it up. We're just practicing suspending our judgment as we notice things in a different way. And so that word you used, being gentle, is really a good description. We're practicing some gentleness with ourselves and with others. And we're not necessarily practicing switching from judging things as negative to judging them as positive. We're actually practicing suspending judgment, noticing our own judgmental thoughts, and being present to things as they are, without having to see them as good, bad, or neutral, simply being present to them. And one of the slightly amusing parts of the practice is that we're even learning to not judge our judgments. So noticing when our judgmental thoughts are taking off, and even with that, learning to smile at them and say, oh, there go my judgments again. That's interesting. Kind of being curious about the judgments that come up for us. And sometimes with mindfulness practice, we get this idea that we're doing it right if we're less judgmental, and we're doing it wrong if we're more judgmental. And even that, we notice that that's a judgmental reaction to our mindfulness practice. So in leading meditations, it's not uncommon that afterwards people say, well, I did better this time, or I really wasn't able to do it this time. And we learn to notice those kinds of comments and those kinds of reactions as judgments in and of themselves. One of the interesting things about mindfulness practices formally, they just give us this window into how we tend to judge ourselves. Am I doing this right? Am I doing this wrong? Do people like this? Do people not like this? Is this right? Is it not? And so that observation of the practice itself can give us kind of a glimpse into how we're approaching the rest of our lives. Humans are very hard on themselves. Like we don't tend to be kind to ourselves. And there can be a tendency even to be harsher with ourselves than with one another at times. And so mindfulness allows us to practice this gentleness, to turn towards ourselves with some more curiosity and openness, and saying, like, maybe there's not always exactly a right and wrong way to do this.
And are Christians any more or less likely to or have a challenge in adopting these practices?
You know, it's a hard answer to give. In my experiences of working with Christians, I have noticed a great openness to this practice, which is counter to the narrative about Christians and mindfulness. So that's why I answer this with a little bit of trepidation. Obviously, the Christian community is huge and diverse around the world. And so in my own communities of Christian faith, people have been very eager to embrace mindfulness. I teach it to Christian college students. I lead it at a variety of different churches with different small groups, and talk about it with all kinds of people, write in a lot of different places about it. Now, having said that, that's all a pretty self-selecting group. So I know that there are many Christians who would be hesitant to engage with the topic, and they're probably not calling me up to speak at their churches. So there is really a diversity of reactions. I personally have not experienced more resistance to mindfulness within the world of Christian faith than I have in other areas. I do think that that we need to be careful about the wording we use in the mindfulness community and make sure that we're using words that are inclusive of people of a lot of different religious traditions and approaches. So I know personally as a Christian, I've encountered plenty of presentations of mindfulness that don't feel congruent with my Christian faith. And there's not always an awareness in the mindfulness community about language that is actually attached to Buddhism or to other faith traditions. And it doesn't need to be attached to any faith traditions. So I really enjoy exploring the Christian connections that can be made with mindfulness practice. But I think it's pretty important that I'm explicit, that I'm integrating those, right? That I'm not assuming that's the only way to talk about mindfulness, but I'm consciously saying, hey, as a Christian, I'm pretty excited to pull some of my God language into my mindfulness practice. There's not always an awareness for people integrating mindfulness with other forms of spirituality, that integration is happening. And so that can sometimes be off-putting to Christians. Some Christians are actually quite comfortable exploring Buddhism as a psychology or as a type of spirituality that does not feel incongruent to Christian faith, and others don't want anything to do with that kind of integration. I think either way, mindfulness can be very accessible to Christians as long as we're thoughtful about the language we're using. And at times I have found myself needing to translate some language that the mindfulness community has gotten comfortable with in a way that might feel more comfortable for Christians. So that's
what are
kind
some
of
examples?
answer, but yeah, I think it's not necessarily more difficult for Christians to accept.
Can you give us some examples of kind of like terms to be wary of or things that are triggering? Not to trigger the audience, but they need a thrill. They got it, they.
Yeah, I think, sometimes the language of mindfulness can just seem a little odd, and it often has more to do with culture than with theology. And so an example I would use, in mindfulness, we often use the phrase the breath or the body. Rather than my breath or my body or your breath or your body. And frankly, if you've never heard that kind of language, it can just sound kind of weird if you're not used to it. And things like that.
Disembodied.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe a little bit too distant. And so I think that's an example of times where I've thought, it could be helpful here to put some context to this. So there is actually a reason that we might use that kind of language, because we are practicing noticing our breath and our body with a little bit of that observational distance. But yeah, we're not trying to dissociate. We're not disembodying ourselves. The goal is more to notice that this is an experience we're having that's passing through, rather than something that has to identify us. It doesn't have to be our identity in the moment. But that's not necessarily obvious unless that's fleshed out a little bit or explored. But I can think of a couple others that are maybe a little bit more direct in terms of Christian interpretations. There's a mindfulness teacher here in town who came to a Christian context and was giving a presentation. She herself doesn't have Christian faith that I'm aware of, hasn't talked about it, and was talking about the saying that you can't wash out blood with blood, as a way of describing thoughts. You can't wash out thoughts with thoughts. It's actually a wonderful metaphor, right? It's actually really useful.
But you can trample down death with death.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you can wash out sin with Jesus' blood, right? So like when you say that in front of a group of Christians, I think that was sort of a trigger. You could kind of see everyone in the room like looking at each other like, wait, like we sing all the time about washing stuff out with blood, right? Like that's part of Christian theology. But sometimes there are just little things like that where if somebody's not raised in a Christian tradition or doesn't hold the Christian faith, they may not be aware of those kinds of triggering things that are said. So those are just a couple examples. I think sometimes in a more general way, there can be some discomfort for some people living in the West when it comes to sitting cross-legged on a cushion or using a bowl that we, ring, the meditation bell. Some of those things are just unfamiliar, and they can be triggers for people that are maybe nervous about something being New Agey or something being Buddhist. And so even if there's not an understanding of why the cushion is helpful during meditation, or an understanding of how this bell is used to call us in or out of a meditation practice, that can create anxiety for people. That's not that's more based on a cultural experience than a theological framework. But as we know, faith gets mixed up with culture all the time. So it's pretty hard to separate out our theology and our culture on a regular basis. And so when it comes to mindfulness meditation practices, I do think it's helpful to just identify for people at times this bell is maybe not one that you're familiar with in your particular cultural context. And if not, you might just practice thinking about it as a beautiful sound, right? We're sort of, using this as a sound that we can rest our attention on that doesn't necessarily have any spiritual meaning in and of itself, other than it being a beautiful sound.
So what would you say to a Christian who's interested in this but has misgivings? I think you address sort of the Asian, the fear of Asian influence, but there's also like you hear people like the contemplative practice has traditionally spiritualized a little more than perhaps is necessary in the modern context. So people bring up, they're afraid of they're going to open themselves up to some bad spirit or something like this. So yeah, what do you say to people who obviously are considering it but have some misgivings based on tradition?
Yeah, so I often encourage people to be specific about those fears. So notice what are the actual perceptions or thoughts or beliefs that are coming up, and then take some time to unpack those. I think that the idea that being in silence would open us up to bad spirits, that is an idea I've heard floated out there on the interwebs, and I know there are people that may perceive it that way. That's not consistent with Scripture. So Scripture encourages us to be still, to know that God is God. There are many, many examples of Jesus withdrawing to quiet, solitary places, and in those places meeting with God. And so I really see this as a sovereignty of God issue, that we can trust that we serve a God who shows up when we seek God, that God is present for those who are seeking that divine connection. And God is not one that if we choose to be silent and to pay attention to what's present, God's not going to run the other way and let evil spirits flood in. We actually have a very powerful God, a sovereign God, who's delighted that we have gotten quiet in a place where we can start to pay more attention to what's going on in the moment. We serve a good God, right? And so I think of this more as an opportunity for us to get quieter so we can pay more attention to God. And certainly recognizing that we all have choices about where we put our attention. There's actually more and more research, faith aside, there's more research on the importance in mindfulness practice of utilizing our choice and our agency in the process as part of making sure that it's a safe practice for everybody. That we have kind of an increasing trauma-informed lens when it comes to mindfulness practice, recognizing that we do need to be intentional about where we put our attention. And so even for people practicing outside of a faith framework, going into any mindfulness practice, it's very important to notice, am I staying inside of this window of tolerance, we call it, this ability to tolerate being fully present in the moment without feeling too flooded and overwhelmed or without feeling too shut down. And so sometimes we may choose to move our attention off of something like breath and notice instead something more concrete, like the feeling on the bottom of my feet or the sounds in the room around me, because that can be more grounding in certain situations. So if we take that general trauma-informed framework and apply that to Christian faith, it's the same principle. Certainly if somebody was in the midst of a meditation and noticed that their mind was consistently getting pulled to a dark, unhelpful place, that may be a moment to make a different choice about where we put our attention. Somebody may want to focus more intentionally on the presence of God in that moment, or more intentionally on something that was grounding for them in that moment. So we don't throw our agency out the window when we practice mindfulness. We don't throw away any control that we have. It's actually quite the contrary. We are becoming more aware, more connected, more in tune, and more conscious about caring well for ourselves in the moment. And I think for Christians, part of that is recognizing that we always have a choice about where we allow our attention to rest.
You brought up some scripture there. Your book is filled with different techniques, the science behind it, but also there's wonderful scripture there to inspire and draw from. Are there favorite passages that you have that you think of or that you use in your practice when talking to people?
Yeah, there are so many. I mean, scripture is obviously just stuffed full of these references, both to stillness, but also just to paying attention. I think some of my favorites are actually some of Jesus' comments about learning to see and hear stuff. I love how he just kind of makes these comments like, have you ears, but you can't hear? Have you eyes, but you can't see? There's almost like a sarcasm to it, right? Which kind of cracks me up a little bit. But that's kind of how I think of mindfulness. Like, you've got these ears, use them. You have these eyes, use them. And so I think that right. God is often sort of like shaking us a little bit, like, wake up, like, I'm right here. Are you paying any attention? Are you noticing? Are you noticing what I'm up to? And Scripture has these references to the way that God is always doing new stuff. So, behold, I'm doing something new. Have you not seen it? Have you not perceived it? And so while there are a lot of maybe more sort of like calming, grounding verses, I think personally those are the ones I enjoy the most is God sort of, chuckling at us and being a little sarcastic, like, hey, open your eyes. Like, look what I'm doing. And I think in my own experiences of mindfulness meditation, part of the most delightful part of me, or for me in those practices, I really enjoy those moments where I feel like I'm able to wake up to God a little bit and notice, wow, these thoughts that are just bouncing around in my brain, when I can start to see them a little bit more clearly, get a little bit more distance, to have just a sudden opening up to God's presence in that moment. It's so liberating. And I do kind of get a chuckle out of it sometimes of like, oh, look at all this stuff that God was up to in this moment. And I was so lost in my head that I was missing all of it. And so it can be quite delightful to just kind of come back to like, okay, right here with God in this moment, in this body, in this space, this is where I am, and this is where I have everything that I need. So I think Scripture is full of a lot of reminders for us to notice where the distractions are and to come back to the moment. Maybe one other verse I would just highlight is that story of Mary and Martha, which I think highlights this so well. That story, it's partially about Martha working hard and Mary sitting at Jesus' feet. But the words that Jesus uses with Martha is, Martha, you're distracted and worried about many things. And that's fascinating, right? It's the distraction that Jesus was highlighting, because we can certainly serve and work without that level of distraction. But man, I sure go through a lot of my day distracted. And so that really speaks to me for Jesus to say, like, Irene, you're distracted and worried by so many things. There's this option to sit at my feet. And I really see that as mindfulness, this option to simply sit and to lay aside your distraction and see what God's up to in the moment.
Oh, that is wonderful. I had hoped that we could maybe do a little exercise, but I think that this is a great full conversation, and that's just a wonderful way to end it. Maybe we could have you come back, or we could, I don't know, do something else in the future.
Yeah, that would be great. And I could highlight, too, if people are interested in a practice, there are a number that I have recorded and put both on YouTube and Insight Timer as well. So if somebody wanted to try out a Christian mindfulness practice, there are plenty of free options online.
Yes, Irene offers trainings, guidance, speaking engagements, and resources, including one of my favorites was the body scan meditation, which is a great technique that sometimes when I sort of fall off the mark of resting in silence, I will quickly do a body scan to just find that I might be holding tension as I have a thought. It actually, I'll notice that I have tension in the body, that then I'll relax. And so the body scan is a great thing to do, and it's a great exercise that's on her website, themindfulchristian.com, and her book, The Mindful Christian, is available on Amazon and other places where books are sold. Thank you so much for coming, Irene, and to everyone who's listening. We'll see you again and hear you again, or you'll hear us again. Maranatha.